I want to try something a little different to start off today. Before we get into any of the ideas or the text or the thinkers around the text, I want to ask you one question. And I want you to actually go there and not just process it intellectually. When you picture God coming toward you, what's the look on God's face? Don't overthink it. Go with your gut. Whatever image just surfaced in your mind in that first 2 seconds, that's the one I'm asking about. Is the look on their face tired? Is it disappointed? Is it something close to the look your father gave you when you came home, having clearly made some poor choices? Does God show up with crossed arms, or a red pen, or some invisible spreadsheet of every time you fell short? Or maybe it's more diffused than that. Just a general sense of being evaluated, of never quite measuring up, of being in a relationship where the other party is fundamentally unsatisfied with you. Now, my hope is that some of you had a warmer image than that. I really do have that hope. I mean, that's the goal, right? But I want to be honest about something. Even if you did, somewhere along the way, most of us were handed a version of God that was less the God of Jesus and more the God of empire. A mechanical, cold, impossibly precise deity whose primary posture towards humanity is disappointment. The philosopher Charles Taylor had a name for what that kind of theology produces in people. He called it the buffered self, a soul so armored against judgment that it can receive evaluation but can't receive love. And I think that describes a lot of us in a lot of pews or seats for a lot of years. I am your host, Reverend Andrew Shipley, with the Missiongathering Christian Church podcast. This is the Rise Up series. This series is a companion to our sermon series at Missiongathering. This is episode 4, and today we're going to talk about where that image of God came from, what it costs us to carry it, and what it looks like to start reclaiming something truer. We're spending time in one of Jesus' most famous stories, the one about the father who runs. Let's go. Walter Brueggemann, one of the most important scholars of the last 50 years, writes that empire always preaches scarcity. Not enough grace, not enough belonging, earn your place or get out. And theology that gets built around that framework ends up producing a God who is essentially a performance reviewer with candles. A God who is watching, always watching, and whose default setting is something between mild disapproval and active condemnation. And I want to say clearly that that image of God is a lie. And a lot of us spent years, some of us spent decades, some of us spent almost our whole lives allowing that distortion to be at the center of our spiritual life. And I think this is part of why so many people in their 20s and 30s who grew up in church describe deconstruction not just as an intellectually disorienting to them, right? But as deeply and personally painful. Because the thing they're discovering isn't just that certain doctrines don't hold up. It's that the God they were handed, the one they prayed to and feared and organized their inner life around, was built to serve someone else's interest. And friends, that's a different kind of grief. So before we get to the story Jesus tells, I think it's worth sitting with that for a minute. With the reality that the image of God we inherit is never theologically neutral. It always comes from somewhere. It always is constructed by someone in some historical moment, serving some set of interests. And when we ask, what is God like? We're never just asking a metaphysical question. we are also asking a political one. People wanted to know what God was actually like, and so they asked Jesus. And Jesus characteristically told them a story. You probably know this story. The younger son goes to his father, asks for his inheritance early, which in that cultural context was essentially saying, I wish you were dead. He takes the money, he leaves, he burns through all of it, and ends up broke and desperate. He ends up feeding pigs, which are unclean animal in a foreign country. It's tragedy in the classical sense, a person whose choices have led them to a place of genuine destitution. And then comes what I think is the gut punch of the whole parable. The moment that deserves more attention than it usually gets. When the son finally decides to go home, he doesn't try to come home as a son. He rehearses a speech. Friend, you've probably had a version of this moment. Lying awake, running through what you're going to say to someone you've hurt. Trying to find the exact combination of words that will be enough, that will land right, that will make them less angry. He's going to come back to his father, not as family, but as a hired laborer. He'll offer to work. He'll make himself useful because he can no longer imagine being simply loved. Sit with that for a second, because I think it's one of the most honest portraits of shame in all of Scripture. He has become so completely enveloped by what he's done, and more than that, by what he believes. It says about what he is, right? That he can't hold the category of beloved son anymore. It doesn't fit the story he's been telling himself on the road. The sociologist Erving Goffman spent his career showing how shame isn't just an internal feeling, right? It's a social architecture. We absorb the evaluating gaze of whoever holds power over us until their verdict becomes the voice inside of our own heads. That boy wasn't just embarrassed about his choices. He had rebuilt his entire identity around the conviction that he was unworthy. As Brene Brown's decades of research land exactly in the same place, where she writes, shame is intensely painful belief that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Not what we did, what we are. That's the prison. That's where this kid starts living when he starts that long walk home. Now, Jesus's audience would have had a certain expectation for how a story like this would resolve. In the moral economy of first century Judea, a son who had done what this son did would face consequences. He would be made to account for himself. There might be a restoration eventually, right? But it would be earned and conditional and properly sequenced. Confession, then punishment, then forgiveness, then maybe reentry into the family. But Jesus, like Jesus usually does, blows the whole thing up. While the son is still far off, a silhouette on the road, still out of earshot, still mid-rehearsal, his father sees him and runs. No interrogation, no 90-day probationary period, no we need to have a serious conversation about what you put this family through. The father runs, embraces him, and before the son can even get his speech out, begins the process of full restoration. A robe, ring, sandals, fatted calf, all of it right now. The Dutch priest Henri Nouwen spent years meditating on Rembrandt's famous painting of this scene, right? And what he wrote about it stayed with me. God's compassion, Nouwen said, is not a response to repentance. It's what makes repentance possible. You see, the running comes first. The welcome comes first. The love comes first. And then, in the warmth of that love, the turning around becomes possible. That's a completely different sequence than the one most of us were taught. So Julian of Norwich, right? She was what was called an anchoress, and those were people who got bricked up in a church and then like were mystics, and they thought about things and they prayed and they had a whole like clerical life, right? In the 14th century, she's walled up in this room while everyone around her is dying, right? Braver than most preachers today. And she records these visions that she has. And she saw, in one vision, she says that she saw no wrath in God, not for a short time, not for a long time. And this isn't just soft or sentimental. I mean, like everyone is dying around her from the Black Plague, the Black Death. Most of Europe is dying. She knew suffering. She was not interested in a theology that couldn't hold darkness. What she was doing was being rigorously, stubbornly honest about what she actually encountered in God. And what she encountered was not a deity waiting on the porch with a checklist. It was a love that runs. See, that's the God I think we lost somewhere along the way. And it's the God we are in the process of reclaiming. So, how did we lose this God? I want to talk honestly about how this happened, how we ended up so far from the running parent and so deep inside the God of the performance review. Because it didn't happen by accident. It wasn't just a series of innocent theological mistakes. Kwok Pui-lan, one of the sharpest post-colonial theologians writing today, argues that empire doesn't just colonize land and bodies and labor. It colonizes theology. It's built its assumptions about power and domination directly into its image of God, and then called that image orthodoxy. She puts it plainly, when God is imaged through the lens of conquest and control, the colonized are left to choose between a God who looks like their oppressor and no God at all. That's not a theologically neutral outcome. That's a weapon. The French philosopher Michel Foucault is not a believer, right? Like not a Christian philosopher or anything like that, but a genuinely brilliant diagnostician of how power operates, showed that the most efficient form of control is not an external force, but an internalized surveillance. When you've been disciplined enough by a system, you start doing the work for it. You police yourself and you monitor your own compliance. You don't need the guard in the room because you've become the guard. And a domination theology does exactly this. It doesn't just wound you on Sunday morning. It follows you home. It sits at your kitchen table at midnight. It wakes you up at 3 a.m. to remind you of everything you've done wrong and everything you still haven't fixed. The womanist theologian Kelly Brown Douglas names what this theology has done to specific bodies with precision, without softening. The Black body, the queer body, the poor body, these bodies have been marked as outside God's image by those who wanted to sanctify their hierarchies. That's not a theological abstraction. That's violence dressed up in a collar. And distortions it produces ripple outward in every direction. If God is impossible to please, then you'll spend your entire life impossible to satisfy. If God only loves the clean, then you will despise your own complexity. If God only blesses the conformists, you'll learn to fear your own becoming. But that's the thing, is that's not backed up in our idea of where we came from, of who God made humanity to be, right? Genesis 1:27, God created the humans in their own image, in the divine image God created them. All of them, not just the productive ones or the respectable ones or the ones who live lives that are legible to the dominant culture. Not just the straight, not just the wealthy, not just the emotionally polished, the theologically tidy, all of humanity, before your resume, before your moral scorecard, before you did a single thing to earn it or lose it, you were made bearing the image of the divine. James Cone, the founding voice of Black liberation theology, said it this way: any God who is not involved in the liberation of the poor and the oppressed is not the God of the biblical tradition. That is the God of the slave master. I think that's worth sitting with how radical that claim actually is, because it's not primarily a political statement, though it has political implications. It's a theological one. The Imago Dei, the image bearer of God, is not a compliment. It is a declaration of war against every system that ranks human worth. Immanuel Kant, who is the second worst person to invite to a party, right? Behind our friend Kierkegaard, approaching the same territory from a completely different direction. In pure philosophical reason, no theology arrived at a strikingly similar conclusion. Treat every human being as an end to themselves, not merely as a means. Never as labor, never as only useful when they produce. Kant called it dignity. The Christian tradition calls it the Imago Dei. The words are different, but the underlying refusal, the refusal to reduce people to their function or their failure or their usefulness, is exactly the same. And there's Simone Weil, like the French mystic and philosopher, who wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. To see someone truly see them, right? Not their role, not their failure, not what they can do for you, but just them as they actually are, is itself a spiritual act. That is what the running parent in Jesus' story does. He sees his son from far off, just a silhouette on the road. No details visible yet, no speech delivered, no accounting given. He just runs. That's the whole theology right there in one image. You don't have to be close enough to be able to understand it, to be able to be understood, to be able to be seen. You just have to be on the road. But Jesus isn't finished, right? Because there's another character in the story. And I think we skip past him too quickly, probably because most of us are him, or at least are him some of the time. The older brother who's been working all day, he comes and he stands outside the party, but he's angry. And he's keeping score, and he's watching his reckless younger brother receive the fatted calf and thinking, are you serious right now? You see, this older brother, he did everything right. He stayed, he was responsible, he was mature. He never felt like he embarrassed the family. He never cost anyone anything, never made anyone lie awake wondering where he was. And none of that, it turns out, earned him what he thought it was earning him. The psychoanalyst Alice Miller wrote about what she called the drama of the gifted child, right? The child who became so accomplished at meeting everyone else's needs and expectations that they lost complete contact with their own interior life. The older brother isn't bitter because he's a bad person. He's exhausted. He's been performing excellence as a survival strategy for so long, he's forgotten that there's any other option. Simon de Beauvoir called this bad faith, the denial of your own freedom in order to maintain a role that someone else assigned to you. The older brother calls it faithfulness, but it's much closer to fear. And here's what I think most readings of this story miss entirely. The parent goes out to meet the older son as well. We always talk about how grace runs toward the rebels, but it also walks towards the rule keepers. It moves towards both of them because both brothers had the same fundamental misunderstanding. The younger brother believed love was lost through failure, and the older one, believed love was earned through obedience. Both were wrong. And the parent in the story refuses to confirm either of their theologies. Developmental psychologist Donald Winnicott wrote about the false self, right? The protective identity we construct to survive our environment at the cost of the true self simply exists without needing to earn the right to be there. A lot of us have been living our false selves for so long that we've genuinely forgotten there was anything underneath. So let me say this plainly. You do not have to perform brokenness in order to need grace. And you don't have to perform perfection in order to deserve love. Both of these children were being offered the same thing. Neither of them had done anything to earn it. I want to land this somewhere practical, because I think this episode carries some real weight. And I don't want to just leave you with it just sitting in the abstract. The first thing is this. Notice in your life where you're still worshiping Empire's God, the harsh one, the cold one, the one who is perpetually unsatisfied. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur wrote that the self is not given, but achieved through a labor of interpretation. You don't choose the image of God you inherited. You didn't choose that image for yourself, friend. But you have the ability to interrogate it. You can interrogate it yourself. You can ask whose interests are served by a God who demands your diminishment, who benefits from your chronic sense of inadequacy, who constructed a theology in which you are always just slightly behind where you need to be. That question is worth sitting with repeatedly over time. Who did this benefit? The second thing is to practice a truer image of God. And I want to be careful here, because I'm not talking about the power of positive thinking or papering over the real struggle with better affirmations, right? We don't do bypass here. I'm talking about something more like what medieval mystic Master Eckhart described, right? That God is found in the soul not by adding anything, but by a process of subtraction. You see, friend, you're not working towards worthiness. You're peeling away slowly and with patience the layers of false theology that told you your worthiness had to be worked towards. And that's a different kind of practice. It's slower, it's less dramatic, but it's so much more honest. And the third thing, maybe the most important one, is that you're called to become the face of God for someone else. Howard Thurman, the mystic theologian who mentored MLK, said, "Don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive, and go do that." Because what the world needs is people who come alive, people who've actually been met by grace, people who have felt that running towards them, who have received the welcome they didn't earn. Those are the people who become grace for others, the person who runs to the others on the road. Be a person who goes out, the one standing outside the party. Be the one who sees the silhouette on the road and moves towards it before there's any accounting, any reconciling being done. So there's this line from Frederick Douglass, right, that goes along with all this. I keep returning to. He wrote that the Christianity of his slaveholders was not the Christianity of Christ. Not even close. It was one that was built to dominate, one that was built to liberate. And the one of Christ, the gospel of Jesus, right? The Christianity of Jesus was built to liberate. And those two things, he said, stand in permanent opposition to each other. And I think a lot of us are in the middle of discovering that distinction for ourselves, learning to tell the difference between the God we were handed and the God that Jesus describes. I'm going to tell you, that's not a comfortable process. But I want to also say, I think it's one of the most important things a person can do. The God of Jesus runs towards the ashamed, towards the exhausted, towards the angry rule keeper standing outside the party, convinced that grace is being wasted on someone who doesn't deserve it, towards the one still rehearsing their apology on the long road home. That God does not wait at the door for the sanitized version of you. That God runs towards the actual, complicated, beautiful, wrecked, still becoming version of you and meets you while you're still far off. Desmond Tutu, near the end of his extraordinary life, said, "My humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together." None of us gets free alone. None of us gets free under a theology designed to make us smaller. If this God runs towards you, and the story says clearly that God runs towards you, then I want to ask you right now, maybe it's time you stop running from yourself. I want to thank you for being here today. If this episode found you at a moment when you needed it, share it with someone who might need it too. Not as a pitch, but just as a quiet, hey, you're not alone in this. You can find us at missiongathering.com, and all the links are in the show notes this week. If you can, just try noticing, what face of God am I assuming right now? See if you can replace it, even once, with something truer. I'll see y'all next week.